Well, good morning from San Francisco and good afternoon, good evening to Austria. My name is Daniel Glazer. I am the Austrian Trade Commissioner here in San Francisco, and it's great to have some of you again with us after our first episode 2 weeks ago, and some of you being with us for the very first time. Welcome to the GoUSA 2023 Startup Talks, a webinar series that our office here in San Francisco and in New York have started together to bring the upcoming trends and different perspectives on the startup and innovation ecosystem in the US to you in Austria. Just a few words about who we are here in San Francisco. As Open Austria, we were founded in 2016. We are part of the Global Außenwirtschaft Austria or Advantage Austria network. We are here located right in the heart in so-called SOMA in San Francisco at a co-working space called Galvanize. And our focus is purely on technology, innovation, and startups. So if you as an Austrian startup are ever in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can always call us up. You can visit us. You can use our space also as a home base to work from here. We give you pitch training. We help you to connect with the local area, local Bay Area ecosystem, and we'll also help you navigate, the Silicon Valley. But today it's really not about us. Today we have a wonderful guest, Daniel Glazer. Don't get confused with the Daniels here. Dan is the managing partner of the London office of the Silicon Valley-based law firm Wilson Sonsini. Dan, it's great to have you with us today.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Today we will be covering the focus of US expansion and fundraising for startup scale-ups from Europe or Austria especially, because that's pretty much your daily bread, right, Dan?
That's what we do here. So I head up our US expansion team, which works with European startups through their US lifecycle: launch, scale, raise venture capital, and then exit through M&A or IPO in the United States.
But so you're based in London, but the firm is in Silicon Valley. How did that happen? Because I heard you told me you actually made that happen. Can you guide us a little bit through that story?
Sure. So about 12 years or so ago, when the UK and European tech ecosystems were just sort of building up, we started to talk to some of the government organizations on this side of the Atlantic, on the Austrian UK side of the Atlantic, and started to hear more and more about how the ecosystems were building and how increasingly the companies were looking to engage with the US capital markets and the US commercial markets. And we found that rather than the companies sort of going across to America and trying to figure it out, we would actually come to them, right? And so after sort of a number of years of, let's say, commuting back and forth, just to confirm product market fit, as the kids these days call it, right? We decided to launch in London with a US team in 2018 to bring actually now a few dozen Americans here on the ground here in London that work with European companies, at all stages, everything from sort of a Y Combinator or Techstars company that's looking to raise a seed round in San Francisco, all the way up to working with companies that are listing on the New York Stock Exchange coming out of Europe, and then everything in between. But most commonly, we start to see companies when they come to us with one of two questions. We're looking to launch in the United States. What do we do next? Or we're looking to raise money in the US. What do we do next? And then we scale with them from there. And that's kind of the American model, is that it's very common to work with the same legal advisor at the seed stage that you do at the IPO or the M&A stage. It's very much a life cycle model in the States.
And I think you already gave us a great introduction to the frame of today's conversation with those two questions, because I think we'll be diving deeper into both of those questions a little bit. So let's start with, when from your perspectives are startups, especially coming from Europe, are actually ready to launch in the United States?
Sure thing. So we find that the most successful companies coming out of Europe, on average, tend to go early or go late. And here's what I mean about going early or going late. There are some companies that very early in their life cycle will decide, what we're building is actually ideal for the US market. It's best suited for the US market, either B2B or B2C. And so pretty early on, what they'll do is that they'll decide to put management on the ground in the United States, usually with a back office, as it were, let's say in Europe, that they might keep their tech team or other functions that aren't necessarily, you know, customer or user facing or investor facing in Europe. But they will put typically management and or sales on the ground in the United States and build as if they were a homegrown US company. In other words, they will Americanize the product or service offering from the beginning and look to optimize it for the US market. They will then go out and look to raise early stage capital from US investors as if they were a homegrown US company. Because for all intents and purposes, they are essentially now a homegrown US company, and it will be easier for them typically to find money in the United States from early stage investors because they've got management on the ground in the United States building it in the US. That's what I mean by going early. Going late, and frankly, going late is much more common these days, I find, given the amount of the robust level of venture capital that is available in the European market. Going late is the company will build, let's say, in Austria, right? It'll raise a seed, probably even a Series A from Europe. And then eventually, and it will optimize the product or service offering for the Austrian or broader European market. And then eventually, it'll be pulled into the US by customer or user traction, right? Or customer user growth, and then decide, okay, we're now seeing some initial interest in the US. Let's start traveling back and forth over to the US and make sure that's real, right? Continue to sell remotely to the US. And then if it looks like there will be ROI, return on investment, then what they'll do is, as an interim step, often hire contractors, right? Sales agents or other part-time consultants to sort of fly the flag for the company in the United States. And to prove out the model a little bit more, to make sure that there does seem to be product market fit, or at least the beginnings of product market fit in the United States. And if that succeeds, then usually what they'll do is they will hire locally and or send people across from HQ and Americanize a product offering or service offering that has been sort of perfected in Austria or more broadly in Europe. And at that point, they'll see how the US business scales, right? And they may even become a dual headquartered business if they find that the US business scales substantially. But really what it's doing is it's starting with a strong foundation in Austria and then building on that once they have the strong foundation in the United States. It's the companies that go in the middle that sometimes struggle. Right, and we do see that sometimes. Like, let's say the company starts to raises a seed round in Europe, but then before they sort of lock down a strong foundation in Europe, maybe, and before they find confirmation or product market fit, they start going after the US market as well, right? And that's pretty difficult, because now you're trying to get product market fit on both sides of the Atlantic in two very different business cultures, with probably limited amount of money and limited amount of bandwidth, right? And we've seen more often than not that European startups really struggle if they're trying to get both right at the same time that early in their life cycle, right? So go early, go late. Going in that middle is sort of where for a fast-moving, high-growth startup, the sort of danger area is, as it were. Oh, I think you might be on mute.
Yep, thank you. Assuming they find the right timing, they go either early or late, they have the strong foundation, or they decide that they want to be a US homegrown company. What do they need to create that US company in the first place? So
let's step back and think and talk about for a second. When do you need a US company? As an Austrian company going to the US, right? And so first off, I'm going to say that to the extent that you need a company, you can do pretty much everything that you need to do in the United States through a wholly owned US subsidiary incorporated in the state of Delaware. We get to that in a second, but you can do everything you need to do to the extent you need a US company through a US subsidiary, with one exception. And we'll get to the exception in a few minutes, but I'll highlight it in advance. That the one exception is if you raise from US investors and the US investor insists that they will only invest in a US parent company, which is not all investors. And again, we'll talk about that dynamic in a minute. But to the extent that you need a US company other than that, it's generally going to be a US subsidiary. But there's many things you don't even need a US subsidiary for, right? For example, if you want to just travel back and forth from Austria into the US, to do meetings, to meet with investors, go to conferences, you don't need a US company for that. If you want to hire US contractors, you don't need a US company for that. You can hire US contractors directly from an Austrian company. If you want to enter into contracts with other companies in the United States, legally, you don't need to have a US company. You can run those contracts directly from the Austrian company. Now, it may be that some US companies might prefer to contract with US companies, although in fairness, most of the time, what those companies really mean is that they want to contract under US law, rather than they would prefer to contract with an empty US subsidiary that has no assets, right? But there's usually no legal requirement to enter into a contract with a US company, that you can enter into a US law contract with your Austrian company. One exception for that, just to make sure that I cover off this nuance, is that if you are contracting with certain branches of the US government, in particular the Department of Defense or the US military, oftentimes you do have to have a US subsidiary, legally speaking, to contract with some of those entities. But certainly, even most government entities and virtually all private company entities, you can enter into a contract with those entities through an Austrian company. But the bright red line of when you absolutely want to have and really need to have a US company, and again, a US subsidiary, is when you hire employees based in the United States. You do not want to hire US employees in the US through an Austrian company for three reasons. Number one, tax. If you hire US employees through an Austrian parent company, you will arguably have a taxable presence of your Austrian company in the United States. And so now you are subjecting your Austrian company to both Austrian tax and American tax, right? And that is suboptimal. Number two, sorry.
Does that also apply to freelancers or external contractors if they do business on your behalf? No.
No. So a contractor who is truly acting as a contractor, I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, who is truly acting as a contractor, you do not create a taxable presence, generally speaking, in the United States by hiring the contractor through the Austrian company. What you have to be careful about, though, is that just because you call them a contractor doesn't mean that they will be deemed to be a contractor under the relevant US states tax regime and laws, right? In other words, as I sometimes joke to companies in the US, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, even if you contractually stipulate that it's a goose. In other words, if you treat the individual like an employee, they're going to be deemed to be an employee, even though you may have this very nice signed contract that says you are a contractor and under no circumstances will you be deemed to be a contractor, right? So in other words, for example, if you hire somebody in the United States and you call them a contractor, but they work full time for you and for no one else, and you call them your chief revenue officer, right? And they have signing authority on behalf of your Austrian company, even though you have a contract agreement, they're probably going to be deemed to be an employee, right? Now, what's a little bit nuanced about this is that each state has its own rules about what constitutes a contractor and what constitutes an employee. And so, for example, in New York State, just to pick a state, it's a little bit easier to bring someone in as a contractor and have them not be deemed an employee than California, where it's actually pretty difficult to bring someone in as a contractor and have them not be deemed to be an employee. So it's very important when you are hiring contractors in the United States that you pay attention not only to what their job description is currently, and make sure that that qualifies as a contractor and not an employee, but also on an ongoing basis, that their role doesn't change to in the future look something more like an employee. Because again, it doesn't matter what the contract says, it matters what they actually do in principle, right? And I'll just sort of go on a little bit on this topic, because I want to highlight, you know, I think one of the bits of feedback that we often get from European startups on this point is I've had many companies say to me, well, I understand that that's best practices, Dan, but frankly, who's going to find out, right? I'm an early stage startup. It's not like the state of New York is going to come in and audit me because I've hired one contractor who looks like an employee in the United States. Fair point. However, we have seen the following fact pattern play out many times over the years. Okay, so Daniel, let's say that, you know, I hired you as a contractor in the United States. Okay, and then maybe after 9 months or so, the relationship goes sour, right? And I say, you know what, Daniel, it's not me, it's you. I need you to go, right? And you feel pretty disgruntled about this, right? And especially because you've been putting in 40 hours a week and you've been signing contracts on behalf of the company, and you've been, you think, a really good citizen of the company. And you realize, because Americans tend to realize their legal rights in a way and leverage those legal rights in a way that's not common necessarily in the rest of the world, that you have leverage over me as an Austrian company, right? And you come back to me and you say, you know, I really like a little bit of severance here for all the time that I've put in for the company. And I maybe balk at that and say, why am I paying you severance? You're not an employee. And you say, you know what, I think you've been treating me like an employee. And in fact, I bet the state of California would love to know that you have not been paying payroll taxes for the past 9 months on an individual that's probably going to be deemed to be an employee. And you wouldn't want me to go to the state of California and tell them, now would you? And now what do you do? Right? So that is called exposure. And so it's really better, best practices, to get this right on the front end rather than find yourself between a rock and the hard place on the back end, right? And I bring this one up because this is a very common mistake that we find European startups make, which is, hey, you know, I want to cut the corner here. Yes, this is probably an employee, but I don't want to bother creating the company, so I'll just bring him as a contractor and I'm sure it'll be fine. It might be fine, absolutely it might be fine, but it might not, it also might not be fine, depending how things play out with the particular individual. But to go back, I guess, to the original point, which is, why would you set up a company when you're hiring US employees? Again, it's for 3 reasons. Number one, you don't want to create a taxable presence of your Austrian company in the United States. Number two, you want to keep any liabilities created by that employee in the United States. In other words, if I'm an Austrian company and I'm hiring a US employee, and if I hire that employee directly from the Austrian company, if that individual creates any liability in the United States, and as you may have heard, the US is a little bit more of a litigious environment than Austria, right? Then that liability without a US subsidiary goes directly back to the deep pockets of the Austrian parent company. And you want to keep that liability in the United States at the subsidiary level to the extent possible, right? And number three, the third reason why you would want to create a US company if you hire US employees is the ambiguity in employment law. If you hire US employees who are protected by certain US employment rules out of an Austrian company, which of course is governed by certain Austrian employment rules. And if there's ever a dispute, those two sets of employment rules don't match up very nicely, right? And that gets complicated at best and expensive at worst, right? To work through that. So again, in summary, the bright red line of when you generally want to create a US subsidiary is when you hire your first US employees. And I can, if it's helpful, I can walk you through quickly what that setup looks like, because I often get sort of the questions like, how long does that take? What are the costs, et cetera? And why don't I walk you through quickly what that would look like? So, because very often the question we get is, okay, I'm going to set up I need to hire my first U.S. employee. What does this all look like? How long does it take? What does it cost? Okay, so let's say, Daniel, you came to me, you're an Austrian company, you said you're going to hire your first employee. I'm going to tell you, you're going to set up a Delaware corporation, wholly owned subsidiary of the Austrian parent company. Why Delaware? Delaware is the closest thing we have to a national corporation in the United States. There's no such thing as a national corporation in the United States. You pick one of the 50 states in which to incorporate in, and Delaware is by far the most common state. It has the optimal set of corporate governance rules, and it's long ago made itself cost-effective and efficient to set up in. I often summarize by saying Delaware reduces friction. That's all you need to remember. As a European company, Delaware reduces friction, right? And then typically you're going to set up as a corporation or as an Inc. There are typically two options: a limited liability company, which is, or otherwise known as an LLC, or a corporation, otherwise known as an Inc. Most of the time, a corporation is going to be the right answer, but it actually depends on the home country's, the parent company's tax rules, right? So, for example, I know for a fact that in the UK, if you had a UK parent company, having an LLC, which is a tax pass-through entity, the parent company is responsible for the LLC's taxes, right? That creates certain complexity that is not necessary for startups, right? Whereas a corporation is a taxable entity, that the corporation itself is responsible for its taxes. And in our experience, most countries in Europe, the right answer is corporation. That being said, I'm not an Austrian tax expert. I believe that the right answer in Austria is to have a corporation, but I always recommend go back and check with your Austrian tax advisors that the right answer would be a corporation, an Inc., rather than a limited liability company, LLC, right? And then finally, a subsidiary rather than a parent company. Again, the only reason you would need a U.S. parent company is if you're raising from U.S. investors, and the U.S. investors say, we will invest, but we will only invest into a Delaware parent company. Because the entire foundation of the U.S. venture capital ecosystem is built on investing into Delaware corporations. And the later stage you are, the more likely that they are willing to deal with the friction of investing into an Austrian GmbH or another parent company. But the early stage you are, the less likely it is. So in other words, if you're going to raise a US-led seed round, it's very likely that a US lead investor would require the company to create a new Delaware holdco. If you're raising, let's say, a Series B round, it's relatively unlikely that they will require what's called that Delaware flip, and instead they will invest in the Austrian company. Okay, so you've got your Delaware corporation, wholly owned subsidiary. You're then going to register that Delaware company to do business in each state where you have employees or offices. Okay, and let's say, for example, you hire your first employees in the state of California. Okay, you'll provide your California employees with two employment documents. Number one, a California state-specific IP assignment and confidentiality agreement, which does what it says on the tin. Number two, a California state-specific offer letter, which has the economics and the financials of the arrangement. And every time that you go to a new state, you're going to do those things over again. You're going to register to do business in the new state as a Delaware corporation operating in that state, and you'll provide them with state-specific employment documents. Importantly, each state in the US has its own employment laws. So you can't just, for example, cross out California in your employment templates and write New York, because the laws are actually completely different in many respects in New York than they are in California. For example, in New York, you can obligate employees to non-compete restrictions. In California, those are illegal, right? So it's important to have a different state-specific template for each state in which you hire employees. Next, to the extent that you want to provide options to US employees, you'll want to look to extend your option plan from your Austrian parent company to the United States. And then finally, On the legal side, you'll want to look at potentially extending your IP, patents and trademarks to the US, Americanizing your terms and conditions for the American market, and potentially looking at complying with US data privacy if in fact, data privacy rules, if in fact you're collecting personal information from American residents. There's 4 other areas you're going to want to cover off, right? Tax accounting, banking, business insurance, payroll and benefits. I'll take each of those very, very quickly. Tax accounting, you're going to want to get your tax accountant to help you get your employer identification number, otherwise known as an EIN, and that's your unique identifier for your US company, and allows you to set up a bank account and allows you to set up payroll and benefits. Okay, your US tax accountant also will help you with certain current and ongoing tax filings. You'll want to set up a bank account for the sub, US bank account for the sub. You're going to want to extend business insurance to cover the US sub. And then finally, you're going to want to set up outsourced payroll and benefits. And that's usually through an organization called a professional employer organization, or a PEO. And a PEO jointly employs the employees together with the subsidiary. It's a co-employment arrangement. Both the sub and the PEO are simultaneously the employers, and that allows you to leverage the PEO's retirement benefits plan, health insurance plan, and payroll system, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel for a small number of employees. Okay, and so those 5 areas, legal, tax, accounting, banking, insurance, payroll, benefits, those 5 areas typically take about 3 to 4 weeks to set up. The legal bits usually take a few days. The bank account, the PEO usually extend that out to about 3 to 4 weeks. And the vast majority of the costs are wrapped up in people. Usually salaries in the US range anything from 1.5 to 3 times what they are in Europe. And payroll and benefits packages are usually about $15,000 to $20,000 per person per year. Assuming that you've got the money for the higher cost US employees and for the payroll and benefits, everything else is a rounding error, right? Business insurance is usually a few $1,000s a year. Tax accounting is usually a few $1,000s a year. Banking is usually, the fees are de minimis. And we ourselves have a fixed fee package which again is usually a couple $1,000s, if that, to set up a US subsidiary and related employment documents, and non-disclosure agreements and consulting agreements in the United States.
That was a lot of information, Dan, but a lot of very detailed information. I think what to consider. At this point, I also would like to tell our audience that, of course, they are more than we invite them to ask their questions in the questions area or raise their hands. We will also happily unmute you to get also other voices into the conversations, not just the 2 of us. So please, whenever you have any questions, you can ask them anytime. I would like to go back a little bit to the question about the Delaware flip, and because one question that we always get is a question about IP. So very often when it's about raising funds, the investors from our experience at least, the investors here want to see the IP also transferred to the Delaware Corp, so that when they invest here, they also invest into the IP. But very often for a Austrian startup or for an Austrian founder, that's something they don't really want to do. How do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really tax efficient to be taking IP out of Austria and putting it into the United States. I mean, we usually see the vast majority of Delaware flip transactions that we work on is the IP remains in the Austrian company or in the European company. You create the new Delaware holdco that owns the Austrian company and everything else under it. And the effective control that the investors get over the IP is by their shareholding and or even their board seat on in the parent company, right? Because the parent company ultimately controls the IP, because the IP is held in a wholly owned subsidiary of the parent company, right? That's usually how this works out, right? Like the IP doesn't necessarily have to be held in the United States to get control over the IP. The IP can be effectively controlled by an ownership interest in the parent company. That's what we usually play out, especially because of the tax inefficiencies, relatively speaking, of moving IP out of Austria and into America.
That makes sense, and I think it it also sounds a bit more doable than giving up your IP and moving it over as a default.
We got actually, and it's much more costly to do it that way, right? I mean, it'll cost in terms of professional services fees to transfer the IP, but it also will cost in terms of a higher tax bill.
So we actually got a question, since we are talking about costs a lot. The question about costs came up, saying, what would be a rough ballpark entry budget for covering all those preparation steps?
Yeah, so that was what I was saying before, is that I'll go back and cover that again. So there's 5 areas, right? Legal, tax, accounting, banking, payroll, and benefits, business insurance. So first of all, salaries. Salaries are going to be high in the United States, and that's why going to the U.S., we often tell companies it's a return on investment play. It's an ROI play. You go to the U.S. if you think you will make more money there by spending more money, right? Yes, the people are more expensive, but if you get it right, they will deliver on average more for the company than if they were sitting in Austria. Like, that's the whole point of it, right? You go to the US because of potential commercial upside, but those people cost, right? So you need to make sure that you're going for the right reason and it's the right investment. And as I said, I think rule of thumb is that you could see U.S. employees, especially in major markets like New York or the Bay Area, could end up being 1.5, 2 times, even three times the salaries of what you might find in Austria or elsewhere in Europe. Payroll and benefits, right? Because you don't have nationalized healthcare in the United States as you do in many countries in Europe, and it's expected that your employer, for the most part, is going to cover your health insurance. It's also expected that you're going to provide a retirement benefits plan, right? And so that together usually ends up costing about $15,000 to $20,000 per employee per year, right? So you got to tack that on as well. The other costs, though, are not massive, certainly not to set up. Again, business insurance is usually a few $1,000s a year, assuming that you're not doing something particularly risky. Banking fees are usually relatively de minimis. And tax accounting is usually a couple $1,000s a year. The legal setup, again, is a couple $1,000s, if that, and that covers not just the sub, but the documents that connect the parent to the sub, and that's the important thing. Not just setting up the company; it's making sure that the subsidiary is tied to the Austrian parent company correctly, or else you're going to have a pretty massive cleanup issue when you look to raise money or you look to sell. That kind of pricing also includes your first employment document templates and your NDAs that you'll need for the U.S. market and your consulting agreements for the U.S. market, right? But the legal costs may scale as you get bigger, right? Like negotiating contracts against American companies, right? American companies tend to negotiate a lot more aggressively than European companies because the chances of a U.S. contract ending up as being the subject of a potential litigation claim are a lot higher in America than in Europe. As a result, American companies pay a lot closer attention to the actual legal terms of their contracts on average, in my experience, much to the great frustration of European startups who are not used to that. And so, yeah, I mean, that could end up costing more than if you're in Europe. But again, the commercial upside of those contracts ends up being greater than in Europe. Remember, that's the whole reason that you're going to the US in the first place, typically, is because the size of the deals that you're going to do are bigger. Yeah.
All right, I think now we've established our cooperation. We are starting to scale. So I think we've covered the first area of our conversation quite well for now. Of course, if any other questions come up, we can always circle back. But also the second question that you mentioned in the beginning is about really fundraising. That's always a big question for Austrian founders that talk to us. So when should Austrian founders start looking to raise money in the US?
Yeah. So let me start by sort of defining terms a little bit. So I'm going to talk about in general terms about US.
I'm still here. Go on.
I talk in general terms about sort of US VCs, right? And when I talk about US VCs, what I mean is this. I don't mean angels, okay? And I don't mean family offices, and I don't mean strategics like corporate VC, and I don't mean American funds that have offices in Europe, because the American funds that have offices in Europe, whether it's in London or Berlin or Vienna or elsewhere, right, that their business model is to look at early stage European startups. When I talk about US VCs, what I mean are like sort of classic financial VCs that are sitting in Silicon Valley or New York, and so most of the time, especially at seed and at Series A, those VCs disproportionately are former startup operators, right? That they worked at startups or they founded startups, right? And to give you an idea of how that's different than in some geographies in Europe, I've seen statistics in London, for example, where there's roughly, I think, something like 65 or 70% of all seed and Series A VCs in the US are former startup operators, whereas in the UK, that's something like 10%, right? That it's much more common for them to be former management consultants, private equity investors, or investment bankers, right? And so if you are coming from a startup background, startup operator background, and you're a VC at seed and Series A, more often than not, you are looking to leverage your expertise and your network, right, to guide the growth of the business. In other words, what you're looking to do is de-risk your bet, as it were, at the casino of seed and Series A, because presumably you know what you're looking for because you've done it previously, right? And as a former startup operator turned VC, you are looking to guide the growth and build American businesses. You know how to build an American business. You don't know how to build a European business, right? And so if a company comes to you and says, I want to raise money at seed or Series A, but I have no US story, nothing in the US. The question is, well, how is an early stage VC going to help you? Like, how is that a better bet at the casino, as it were, than all of the homegrown American opportunities? And if the response is, well, okay, if you give me the money, I will move to the United States, the response to the VC more often than not is, no, it's the other way around, right? I have no idea whether you're going to be able to succeed in the United States. You've shown nothing in the US, right? If you show something in the US, then I'll take a look at it. And so what that leads to is a dynamic of, more often than not, and by the way, there are always exceptions to these things, right? But more often than not, seed is local, A is national or regional, and B and beyond is global, right? And if you're based in Austria and you're looking to raise in the US, that's really a global round. And so if you are looking to raise seed or Series A with a US VC lead, more often than not, you need to tick one of four boxes, not all four, but one of the four, more often than not, in order to attract a US lead investor. Number one, management on the ground in the United States, right? That at that point, if you've got management on the ground in the United States, CEO, CFO, COO, co-founder, whatever, that's someone who the VC can work with to help guide the growth of the business, right? It's not a tick box exercise. I sometimes have companies come to me and say, oh, I just hired, a relatively low level software engineer who's sitting in Mississippi. I now have a US presence. I should be able to raise from Silicon Valley VCs now, right? No, it doesn't really, it's not a tick box exercise, right? Number two, again, these are ors and not ands. Number two, strong revenue traction or user growth in the United States, showing that you've got the beginnings or actual product market fit when you're offering in the United States. Number three, experience at the management level of raising money from US VCs previously. In other words, if you've already shown as a management team that you are a proven quantity in the United States, that's particularly helpful. Now, if you've got no US story whatsoever, then number 4 is you have truly built the better mousetrap. In other words, you are offering something that is so far and better, so obviously better than anything that's available in the US, that the VC will overlook the fact that that is a massive obstacle to overcome, that you are an early stage startup sitting in Austria with nothing in the United States. Again, it happens, but it's relatively rare.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. We do get, and as you say, there's always also exceptions to the rule. There are VCs who are now, I think, also based both in Europe and the US.
Exactly.
So I think the ecosystem has also outgrown a little bit Silicon Valley, and a lot of new offices have opened shop in Europe, such as Wilson Sonsini as well. So Europe has become an interesting market. But as you say, I mean, ultimately the US itself is a 350 million people market, relatively unified depending on the industry you're in. So so the upscale in the US is a different one than in Europe. That's just where you have to enter market by market by market. So it makes sense that VCs in the US want to have feet on the ground and see a driven approach towards the US before they go in big.
So, and a couple of things. First of all, the later stage you are, the less that the presence matters, right? Again, yeah. By the time that you get to Series B and later, those are typically global rounds based a little bit more on metrics, right? But the other thing is, and I want to pick up on your point about the US funds in Europe, that's key. I mean, too often I talk to European startups who say, I want to go raise from US investors. And their first thought is, I want to go out to Silicon Valley and do a roadshow and start meeting all the VCs up there. And I'm like, you do know that there's about 36 US funds that have opened up in Europe. And their whole reason for existence is to find high growth, high potential European startups, right? Whereas if you go right to Silicon Valley, you're trying to convince them to come into early stage startups across what, a 9-hour time difference and a 12-hour flight. It's hard enough even if they were local, right? So if you do think that US money is the right answer, don't overlook the fact that you've got a whole bunch of those funds on the ground in Europe. Yeah,
for sure. We did get in a question that goes also a little bit back to the topic of hiring and having personnel. Well, I think a very practical question. So how to find the best people in the US? A founder here is telling that they are really trying to find business development people in their area, but it's really difficult to find the people, and it's not even a matter of salary, because they are aware that costs are higher in the US. It's just the pure act of finding those people seems to be really difficult right now.
Yeah. So look, I mean, even American companies are struggling with this to some extent, but I'll highlight a couple of things. I mean, number one, I'm not saying that this is a magic bullet, but it is worth getting recommendations for good recruiters, right? That especially if you're looking for salespeople or other senior executives, reach out to a recruiting firm that has experience working with European companies. It's important that they have experience working with European companies, because the way that European companies look at employees and look at hiring employees and work with their employees is a little bit different than American companies. And the recruiting firm will have a better idea of who's a good fit if they've had experience working with European companies hiring in the US before. It is also important to leverage your network to identify these individuals, because the best individuals the recruiters might not be able to find, right? And you need to think about, okay, who do you know in your network? Who are your investors, and can they help you, network in the U.S.? Like, what other founders and others in the ecosystem do you know? Leveraging government organizations, right? And asking about what resources they have on the ground in the different markets in the US to identify people. I mean, there's no sort of simple magic bullet answer that you do this, you will find people, right? But there is just simply increasing the odds of finding people and casting a wide net, so that not only you're seeing lots of individuals, but other people are on the lookout for you.
Yeah, and definitely having, you know, recommendations from people you trust, and where maybe already, you know, they've been proven contacts and proven partners is very essential, because it can be very costly very fast to find the wrong people, if you, whatever wrong means, but people who might not match your, you know, your mission, or match or fulfill, you know, expectations, and that those costs are very high very fast in the US.
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about that, though, or maybe the saving grace on that is, of course, the US is termination at will and employment at will, which means that there generally is no notice period or anything like that to terminate somebody. You literally can walk in tomorrow and say, I don't think it's working out, and they're gone, right? Now, you got to be careful about that, because if they feel that they've been discriminated against, they could also threaten a claim against the company. Again, that's just kind of part of the United States in that regard. And so when you terminate them, you're going to typically want to provide them with some sort of severance payment in exchange for them signing a release of claims against the company, right? It's a little bit like buying the piece from the employees on the way out the door. But technically speaking, you know, you can terminate people immediately, and you really do need to be pretty ruthless about that sometimes, in the respect that if it's somebody who is clearly not working out and who has a very high salary, every day that you keep them on and it's clear that they're not the right fit is costing the company money.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of challenges, but the potentials in the US are usually worth it, and are quite high.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, just to quickly jump in on that, you know, I think too many companies coming out of Europe, when they understand the administrative and logistical complexities of the US, like the 50-state system with the federal overlay, and, you know, the greater reliance on legal support and other professional services, I feel like there's sometimes a bit of irrational despair. And it's easy to forget why they wanted to go in the US in the first place, which is the massive capital and commercial markets, right? And I've been doing this long enough to know that I think a lot of that concern and the frustration comes from just simply, it's not the way that you do business in Europe, right? Like, it's all just a little bit simpler. But I'll tell you that this is just a matter of what are you used to, because, you know, I tell companies this all the time. If we had this discussion about, well, how do you treat employees, and, you know, the litigation environment and the cost and all this, we were having those discussions in California, those founders would just shrug and say, I don't, whatever. Like, yeah, this we know this. This is, who cares? This is like what I use my lawyer for. It's what I use my accountant for. This is what I get people to do this. These people do this stuff, so I can focus on raising money and building the biggest business possible, right? And I think that too many European companies get hung up on these complexities because it's not what they're used to. Recognize that your American competitors brush this stuff off and just keep going. And I don't mean brush it off as in ignore it. I mean they compartmentalize it, they get somebody to take care of it, and then they just focus on killing it with their business.
Yeah, I think a lot of the aspects, and of course very valuable aspects that we covered today, are the logistical, the legal aspects, but of course mindset and culture of how to do business is a whole different webinar, you know. And we also put a lot of emphasis of trying to convey those aspects of coming to the US, of how different the culture and the mindset here is of your not only competitors but also potential partners, of pretty much everyone in the ecosystem, right? And it sometimes it's a little bit misleading that we think we know the US just because it's, you know, we've learned the language in school and we speak it maybe also in the UK or with people in the UK, and we know the US from movies, but on the ground the culture and the mindset is very different. And it's also different between New York, Texas, and California. And it's important to have also partners that, or partners on the ground that help you navigate the culture aspect of that as well. How you negotiate, how you even get in touch with people is slightly different than what we are used to. And also this, hire fast and fire faster, drastically spoken, is a little bit, goes against also our mindset and our, approach to work culture, and I think creates also sometimes friction when coming to the US.
And it's not for everybody, right? I mean, that's the thing. I mean, is that I always tell companies is that don't start spending the money on the US until you really have identified a pathway of why you think it's the right place for your business. I mean, the most common mistakes that I see for companies going to the US are the ones that sort of go too quickly. In other words, that they assume that the streets are paved with VC gold and there's other multi-million contracts just waiting for them. All they have to do is show up, and they throw a whole bunch of money at the US, but there's actually not product market fit. But then the other mistake is not going quickly enough, which is that you get a foothold, but then you don't recognize, right, that you need to follow that up. That homegrown American tech companies typically are fairly nimble, they're fairly aggressive, and they're often well funded. Right, and they will move fast if they see a market opportunity in a way that we don't see companies typically, on average, move as quickly in Europe. Right, so it's not that you really got to decide. What are you trying to do in the U.S.? Are you trying to just get a little bit of a foothold, make it one revenue source of many global revenue sources, or are you trying to scale a substantial U.S. business? And if you are looking to scale a substantial U.S. business, recognize that is not just a monetary commitment, but it's a time and a mindset commitment that will look potentially very different than the commitment in Europe.
I think I couldn't have wrapped it up any better, Dan. As unbelievable as it sounds, we are done with our time. It was a very fast hour, at least for me. Thank you so much for all the insights, for all the deep dives into certain topics. I think it was a very fast but very valuable overview, and I'm sure if people have follow-up questions, they can get in touch with both of us, and we can always forward questions to you. And you are just a quick 2 hours flight away, technically, from Austria. So
yeah, so the whole reason that we're here in London, right? And I'd love to go to Vienna, one of my favorite cities, and the whole reason that we're in London is to be here on the ground near European startups that are thinking about the United States. So please do feel free to reach out. I'm about the easiest person to find on LinkedIn. And if you are looking at U.S. expansion and fundraising, we'd be thrilled to help.
Awesome, thank you so much. And before we close the webinar, we also believe that there needs to be good ways to get a first taste of the U.S. market without sinking too many costs and without going down a long path and losing out. And so we've designed together with our partner offices a program that goes, what was usually called, maybe some of you heard of it, the Go Silicon Valley Initiative. That's now the GoUSA Startup Landing Zone program. It's been around in one way or another for 15 years. We accelerated 200 startups from the Austrian ecosystem in the US. Most of them came to San Francisco, but last year we decided we want to expand the program, and we ran an accelerator at the same time in San Francisco, New York, and Boston. This year we flipped New York for Austin as a new and upcoming and very hot ecosystem, and we are inviting once again 20 Austrian startups to join us in September and October, either in San Francisco, in Austin, or in Boston. In Boston, the applications are specifically for health tech, medtech, and digital health companies. In Austin, we are focusing on everything that's impact oriented, so climate tech and sustainability. And in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, we are focusing on software companies and Web3 companies. The program is a 4 weeks in-person program on 3 locations. We'll be building networking events specifically for the startups, depending on from which areas they come. We have a mentoring program. So for the entire duration of the program, you have a mentor from the ecosystem that's either from your industry or will help you with a specific business area. We build workshops, and we offer workshops and coaching sessions with experts here on the ground. And you can use the incubator and co-working space for the duration of the program. And the timeline for the program is that the application is actually already open. We'll pre-select the startups mid-April, announce the selected startups, the winners, as we'd like to call them, as well in the end of May, and in September and between September and November, the 3 programs will take place here in the US. The goal is really to test and validate your product or service in the US, get a first glance of the feedback from potential customers, partners, or investors. Also get more US investor ready if this is your goal to actually scale and launch in the US, and also find the right strategic partners. We've built these new vertical programs where in Boston and Austin, we're more focused on certain industries. And the duration of the program, since it's not just a 3 or 5 day program, but actually a 4-week program, helps you really immerse yourself deeper into the ecosystem and build a more sustainable network as well that you take with you home. And our mentors have always been one of the most valuable part of the program, as they will become your trusted advisors and guides throughout the program, and sometimes very often even beyond. The program technically is for earlier stage startups, because who really want to get a first glance at the US. You should be definitely interested in US already, so there should be first ideas of how a strategy entering the US should be there. And you could also be a startup that's preparing to raise. Our team for the GoUSA is myself. I'm going to coordinate Austin. Natasha, my colleague here in San Francisco, she's coordinating San Francisco. And our colleague in the New York office is coordinating the Boston program. You have our email addresses. It's quite straightforward. It's sanfrancisco@dko.at or New York@dko.at. And so if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. So to sum it up, thank you so much, Dan, for being with us. Thanks everyone who joined our webinar, our second part of the GoUSA Startup Talks. Next week already, we are covering the topic of immigration for Austrian founders. So while today Dan explained to you how to set up a company, next week we are actually covering the question how you as a founder can also make it happen to be actually located in the US, with the amazing Sophie Alcorn from Alcorn Law, also based out of Silicon Valley. So join us also next week on the 1st of March to our next GoUSA Startup Talk. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening in Austria. Have a great afternoon in the UK. And our day here in San Francisco is just about to start as the sun just came up. Thank you so much.